Well, good morning. Welcome to Nerdwords. I am the nerd, and here are some words. So, today I want to talk about proto-metal. I've been listening to a lot of proto-metal albums, and proto-metal is this weird genre of music that technically doesn't even exist. There's no Wikipedia page for it. There are a couple articles online for what is called proto-metal, about the music that originated from this time period, but there isn't really a lot of focus on it. A lot of the bands from this era are not very popular. They didn't have hit songs. Some of them, amazingly, had careers well into the 80s and 90s, but for the most part, I don't even know what you'd call them. They're kind of like, they're not even one-hit wonders. They just sort of appeared during this era and have either fizzled out or carried on. Their music changed over the years. Basically, from 1969 to 1974, there's this sort of era of music where people were really influenced or inspired by Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and Black Sabbath, who were all very successful in 1969. And the music that they made either mimicked, was inspired by, or was influenced by the success of those three bands. All the way up until 1974, which is kind of where you see Alice Cooper, Judas Priest, and Iron Maiden becoming more popular. Black Sabbath's sound actually derives more and more into a heavy metal sound as their albums progress. But for the most part, all these other bands kind of are just there. They exist in this sort of equilibrium between being a classic rock band and being a heavy metal band, or even a progressive rock band. Because you can listen to some of these albums and you can tell, wow, this sounds like really early heavy metal, and then there are some songs, sometimes on the same album, that sound like, wow, this sounds like a progressive rock band that just hasn't found its voice yet. It's a really interesting time, and I've been finding lots and lots of albums about it. But it has brought me back to this idea that I always return to about the classifications of music. Classifications of music are really only useful from a historical perspective. Otherwise, it's just a marketing term to sell music. It's like a hip advertising lingo. I suspect that it must have been really exciting to have lived in the early 70s when these bands were coming out, thinking that it was the beginning of like a new era of music. Which it was, but none of these bands took part in the eras that came after them. Very similarly to when I was in high school in the early 90s, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Stone Temple Pilots, Soundgarden, these were all bands that nowadays we just kind of call them grunge rock. But back then, everyone said, well, we don't know how to classify this music. It's alternative rock. I mean, come on, it's just rock and roll, right? So back then, in the 90s, it was really exciting, feeling like, oh, we're on the verge of like people making music new, in a new way, and going in different directions. But they weren't really. They just had a different way of recording, or they had a new sound that kind of influenced how they were performing or how they were recording. And that led to other bands in the late 90s that are sometimes classified as into that genre, but don't sound anything like them. And the same could be said for these proto-metal bands, because a lot of them, they don't really sound heavy metal, but you can kind of tell that they were going in that direction. And some of them don't sound like progressive rock either, but you can kind of tell that they were going in that direction, but they just never found their footing. A lot of the bands in the 70s that were classified as heavy metal in the 70s, we don't consider heavy metal anymore. REO Speedwagon, Fleetwood Mac, Cheap Trick was one of them. Those guys aren't heavy metal. They're like classic rock now. But really, what is classic rock except a label to put on old music in order to sell it to people? I mean, it just keeps coming back to, it's rock and roll. It's fucking music, right? Nowadays, we have I'll give you another example. Like nowadays we have this idea of like what punk music sounds like. And punk in the late 70s was a much wider category than what we consider it today. Like Devo was considered punk. The Residents were considered punk. And we wouldn't even put those two bands anywhere close to one another now. So, yeah, it's all a bunch of advertising bullshit. Oh, I also wanted to bring up, in 1993, the soundtrack to the movie Judgment Night, which is not a very good movie, but it's an awesome soundtrack. It featured heavy metal bands with hip-hop artists, and it kind of created the genre of rap rock, or rap metal, which, again, it's just a classification of music to sell music to people. But you listen to the compilation of songs on that album, on that soundtrack, and it really rocks. It's an amazing soundtrack. Every song on there is really good. But at the time, nobody knew what to call it. So you can read old reviews of that soundtrack, and you can tell that the critics are really struggling on how to describe it. And they really could have just been calling it, well, this is like pure rock and roll. These are people creating something new and vivid, and you should listen to it. And even now, almost 20 years later, I'm going to say, well, more than 20 years, I'm going to say, yeah, you should go find that soundtrack because it's really good. Anyway, from a historical perspective, proto-metal is really fascinating to me because you can hear these bands and you can kind of tell where heavy metal sprung from, and you can kind of tell where progressive rock sprung from. And you can hear also where their inspirations started. I'm going to include a Spotify playlist because a lot of these bands can be found on there. But my top 3 favorite that I've been listening to the most, only 2 of them can be found on Spotify. The third, I almost screwed that up. The third, you can only listen to it on YouTube. So if the link goes down, I'm sorry about that. I'll try and fix it. But it's basically an album by Randy Holden called Population 2. I don't know if there was a Population 1 or not, but it's really fascinating because you can tell that it's like early heavy metal, but it's been influenced by Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple's success. It's a really good album. Headbanging. I haven't done that in years. I wanted to end on this little anecdote. About 2 weeks ago, I was down in Indianapolis, and this very drunk white guy comes up to me, points at my shirt, and says, "Oh man, I love that band. They're so good." And I had to point out to him, this is a video game, dude. It's not a band. And maybe I'll make a video about this in the future, but don't judge everyone by what they look like. That's the lesson he learned that night. Or maybe he didn't. Who knows? Who cares? Thank you very much for watching and listening, and I'll talk to you next week. I love you.